So our unit begins in 1713, but in order to get a full picture of what's been happening up until this point, we need to take 30 seconds to back up and understand. First Nations had been living off the land for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. So before we can even start the conversation, we need to understand that they were already living in Canada. This was their home. Let's take a quick look at the French. They have notable figures like Jacques Cartier and Samuel du Champlain, who were some of the earliest explorers from Europe to Canada. And the French people were really the first European nation to send people over to Canada in masses. Sometime later, the British, always eager to expand their empire, started incentivizing people to come over to Canada and many other nations around the world so that they could colonize and stake a claim for those different lands. Now, we really won't be doing this justice unless we take a moment to recognize a total difference in perspective. So you have your First Nations, and they've been living off the land for years, but they don't consider themselves the owners of the land. They don't think any human can own land. They use the land, they live off the land, they build their structures on the land and live there, but they don't consider themselves the owners of that land because no one can own land. The French and the British, however, have a very different perspective, much closer to how we view land today. Think about it. If your parents own a house, they consider that small patch of land their property. They own it. So you can imagine how some of those early conversations would have went. Right, tell me, good sir, can you please inform me as to who is the owner of this land? Nobody is the owner of this land. So what you're saying is that nobody owns this land? Yeah, nobody owns this land. Can you believe this guy? Just one more time to confirm, you do not own this land. No. And so upon hearing that nobody owned the land, even though the First Nations and the French and the British were having completely separate conversations because of their differences in perspective, because it's not what the First Nations meant at all, the French and the British were both like, mine? Let's fast forward to the year 1700. The King of Spain dies without an heir, so a whole bunch of European countries, including, you guessed it, the French and the British, start warring over in Europe to try to take control of that land as well. They duke it out for over a decade, and that brings us to 1713. After over a decade of war, all the countries participating finally agree to meet and settle their differences. But do they meet in France? No. Do they meet in Britain? No. They meet in neutral territory so that everybody feels safe. They meet in Holland, in a place called Utrecht, and I've heard it pronounced a lot of different ways, so I may not be saying this right. Anyway, after 18 months, they finally come up with this treaty that everybody signs, and they say, we'll stop warring with each other if you do this, and we'll do that. And like most compromises, it works, but nobody's really happy. The reason this is important to Canadian history is because as part of this treaty, the French gave over a bunch of their land in Canada to the British. And remember, when I say the French land, I mean land that the French is occupying, but First Nations had already been using and living off that land for thousands of years and are still there. So with their newfound land, the British start forcing First Nations people from their homes and killing them and selling them into slavery. So no big surprise, the Wabanaki Confederacy, which is made up of several communities of First Nations people, side with the French and start rebelling and attacking back against the British, who were doing all these terrible things to them. So in an attempt to get the First Nations to stop attacking the British create a separate treaty, the Treaty of Portsmouth, where they make some promises and concede some things to the First Nations. But this treaty was written in English and interpreted for the First Nations, so we have no idea that they know at all what they were signing or agreeing to. Either way, the British went ahead and broke all those promises anyway, so the treaty was broken. Add the key points from this section to your flipbook, and we'll see you in the next video.